Frozen wolves beg man to enter the house. The cold that watches. The snowstorm had come out of nowhere. One moment, Daniel had been driving through a quiet stretch of the northern woods, his truck rumbling steadily along the snow-covered road. The next, the sky had darkened, and the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls. Snowflakes, thick as cotton, swallowed the landscape, reducing his visibility to almost nothing. Then, the engine coughed. Daniel barely had time to mutter a curse before the truck shuddered and rolled to a stop. His breath curled in front of him as he tried the ignition again. Nothing. Just the useless clicking of a dead battery. "Damn it!" he hissed, leaning back in his seat. He was alone. No cell service, no other cars, and miles from the last sign of civilization. He glanced at the gas gauge, nearly full, so it wasn't fuel. The truck had simply died. He exhaled sharply and pulled his coat tighter around him. There was no use panicking. He needed to find shelter before the storm got worse. That was when he saw them. Through the swirling snow, dark shapes moved just beyond the reach of his headlights. Wolves, 5 of them. They stood in a loose semicircle around his truck, their fur thick with frost. Their eyes, too intelligent, too knowing, glowed like embers in the night. They didn't snarl or growl. They didn't move like predators circling prey. They just watched. Daniel's heart pounded. Wolves were rare around here, and they certainly didn't act like this. A creeping unease slithered up his spine. One of them stepped forward. It was larger than the others, its coat an unnatural shade of silver white, as if sculpted from the very snow around them. Its ears twitched, and then, impossibly, it bowed. Daniel's breath caught. A trick of the storm? A hallucination? But no, another wolf followed suit, lowering its head in a strange, almost reverent gesture. Then another. The largest wolf turned and padded away, pausing only to glance back at him, eyes burning with silent command. "Follow." Daniel swallowed hard. Everything logical in him screamed to stay put. Wolves were wild animals, unpredictable and dangerous. But another gust of wind slammed against his truck, rattling the doors, and he knew he wouldn't last long out here. He took a deep breath, zipped up his jacket, and stepped out into the storm. The house that shouldn't exist. The cold was brutal. It sliced through his clothes, biting into his skin like unseen claws. The wolves moved ahead, their forms almost spectral in the blinding white. They never ran, never strayed too far, always keeping pace just ahead of him. Then, through the veil of snow, Daniel saw a house. Not a cabin, not an abandoned shack, but a house, large and old, with dark wooden frame half buried under years of ice and frost. It stood where no house should stand, in the middle of nowhere, with no signs of a road leading to it. The wolves stopped at the foot of its frozen steps. The silver one turned to him, eyes locking onto his. Daniel hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back. The house was wrong. But the wind howled, sharp and unforgiving, and he knew he had no choice. He stepped forward. The wooden steps groaned beneath his weight, the sound echoing in the frozen silence. The wolves remained behind him, watching. With a shaking hand, he reached for the door. It wasn't locked. It wanted him to enter. He pushed it open, and the warmth hit him like a wave. The hallway of whispers. The inside of the house was impossibly warm. A fire crackled somewhere unseen, casting flickering shadows across the wooden floor. The air smelled of old wood, melted wax, and something sweet. Daniel stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft click. He turned back. The wolves were still outside, staring at him through the frost-covered windows. Their glowing eyes reflected the firelight, unblinking. A shiver, not from the cold, crawled over his skin. "Hello?" His voice barely rose above a whisper. Silence. The house stretched before him, long hallways lined with dust-covered paintings. The faces in the frames were indistinct, their features blurred as if time had eroded them. He moved forward, his footsteps muffled by a thick Persian rug. Something about the house felt familiar. The way the light hit the staircase, the scent in the air, it tugged at something buried deep in his memory. He didn't belong here, but he had been here before. A sound broke the silence. Tap, 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 footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the end of the hall. Daniel's breath hitched, his muscles tensed. He turned the corner and froze. A woman stood there. She was pale, too pale, her skin almost translucent beneath the glow of the candle she held. Her dark hair fell in long, tangled waves, framing a face both familiar and unfamiliar. She looked at him, her lips parting as if to speak. But before she could, her face glitched. Like a broken screen, her features twisted and flickered, distorting for half a second before snapping back. Daniel stumbled back, his pulse thundered in his ears. The woman smiled. "You shouldn't have come back." The candle in her hand flickered, and the house screamed. The house that breathes. Daniel's body tensed. The scream that had erupted from the house was not human. It was something deeper, something guttural and ancient. The very walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, a low, keening wail that rattled his bones. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scream stopped. Silence pressed in around him like a heavy weight. The woman, if she was even human, stood motionless at the end of the hall, her candle casting flickering shadows against the walls. Daniel took a step back. His breathing was shallow, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What?" His voice cracked. "Who are you?" The woman's face twitched. Her lips moved, forming silent words. Then, with a strange, slow grace, she lifted one trembling hand and pointed. Not at him. At the door behind him. Daniel's skin prickled. Something was standing behind him. The air thickened, growing dense with a smell both sweet and foul, like rotting flowers left too long in a vase. His limbs locked up, his body instinctively refusing to turn. The wolves were still outside. He could feel their presence beyond the frosted windows, watching, waiting. A whisper brushed against his ear. "Run." The moment the word touched his mind, Daniel moved. He lunged forward, away from the unseen presence behind him, crashing into the nearest doorway. The wooden floor groaned under his weight as he stumbled into a dining room. The feast that waits. The room was untouched. Unlike the dust-coated hallway, the dining table was pristine. A grand feast stretched before him. Golden roasted meats, gleaming silverware, ripe fruit piled high in glass bowls. Candles flickered in elegant holders, their wax dripping onto a blood-red tablecloth. Daniel's stomach twisted. The food smelled rich and intoxicating, but the longer he looked at it, the more wrong it became. The meat glistened too much, its juices pooling unnaturally thick on the plates. The fruit was swollen, overripe, their skins barely containing the pulsing mass beneath. And then there were the plates. They weren't empty. They were set for five. 5 plates, 5 silver goblets, 5 identical chairs. His breath caught. There were 5 wolves outside. A floorboard creaked. Daniel's head snapped up. The woman had followed him. She stood in the doorway, candle still in hand, watching him with that same eerie stillness. She tilted her head slightly. "You shouldn't have come back." Daniel swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about. I've never been here before." A sad, knowing smile curled at the edges of her lips. "Haven't you?" Before he could answer, a wet, gurgling sound came from the table. His eyes darted down. The meat was moving. Something shifted beneath the roasted flesh, a writhing, pulsing mass just beneath the crispy skin. The golden brown surface cracked open, revealing something pink and raw and breathing. Daniel lurched backward as the entire table shuddered. A low growl rumbled from beneath the floorboards. Not a human growl, not an animal growl, something deeper, something hungry. The woman's eyes darkened. She exhaled sharply, as if disappointed. They're waking up. The candles flickered, the shadows on the walls shifted, and the house began to breathe. The wolves at the door. Daniel ran. He didn't think. He didn't try to understand. He just ran, his boots slamming against the wooden floors as he bolted for the front door. He could hear the woman's voice behind him, distant and distorted. "It won't let you leave." His hands fumbled for the door. He twisted it, pulled, locked. Panic surged through him. He yanked at the door with all his strength, the old wood refusing to budge. Then, outside, a shadow moved. The silver wolf. It had stepped onto the porch, its glowing eyes locked onto Daniel's through the glass. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one massive paw and scratched the door. Once, twice, 3 times. A strange pressure coiled around Daniel's skull, the sound of the scratches reverberating inside his mind. And suddenly, the lock clicked open. Daniel didn't hesitate. He shoved the door open and stumbled onto the porch, gasping for breath as the cold air hit his face. The wolves were there, all 5 of them, standing in a perfect formation around the entrance. Their eyes burned with something not of this world. The silver one stepped forward, and then it spoke, not with words, not with sound, but directly into his mind. "You don't remember, but you will." Daniel's body went rigid. His breath came in short, sharp bursts. The wolves turned, padding away from the house. They moved as one, their forms blending with the swirling snow. Daniel's legs trembled. His instincts screamed at him to follow them. But behind him, the house whispered his name. A voice he should not have recognized. A voice he had not heard in years. "Danny?" The voice from the past. Daniel froze. The whisper that drifted from inside the house. It wasn't just familiar. It was impossible. "Danny?" It was soft, hesitant, carrying the weight of years lost. His pulse pounded in his ears. His breath curled in front of him, mingling with the frost that clung to the house's porch. It couldn't be. That voice belonged to someone long gone. The wolves stood motionless around him, their glowing eyes locked onto his every move. The silver one, the largest of them, lowered its head, a silent warning. "Don't go back inside." Daniel swallowed hard. His body was still trembling from what he had seen, the breathing table, the shifting shadows, the house that seemed alive. Every instinct screamed at him to run. And yet... "Danny?" The voice wavered, fragile as breaking glass. His throat went dry. "Number." It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. It was the house, playing tricks on him. But his legs had already moved. Ignoring the wolves' unspoken warnings, Daniel turned and stepped back into the house. The warmth swallowed him whole. The room that waited for him. The door swung shut behind him with a soft click. The house was silent. The dining room was empty. The grotesque feast had vanished as if it had never existed. The air smelled different now, still old, still tinged with something wrong, but there was a new scent woven into it. Lavender. Daniel's breath hitched. That was her scent. His heart pounded as he moved down the hallway, drawn forward by something he couldn't name. His boots barely made a sound against the worn wooden floors. A single door stood slightly ajar at the end of the corridor. From the darkness beyond, the scent of lavender was stronger, and then a shadow moved inside. Daniel's fingers twitched at his sides. His body was screaming at him to turn back, but his mind whispered something else. What if it's really her? He reached for the door and pushed it open. The woman in the chair. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by a single oil lamp on a bedside table. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by his entrance. And there, sitting in an old wooden chair near the window, was a woman. Her back was to him. Her long, dark hair spilled over her shoulders, just as he remembered it. She was sitting unnaturally still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Daniel's throat tightened. It was her. "Mom?" The woman stiffened. Slowly, too slowly, she turned her head. Her face was almost right. Almost. The shape of her features, the curve of her lips, they were so close to what he remembered, but her skin was too pale, too smooth, like porcelain left too long in the cold. And her eyes, they were empty. Black pits, endless and hollow, but she was smiling. "Danny," she whispered, "you came back." Daniel staggered backward. No, this wasn't. His mother had died 10 years ago. He had buried her. This wasn't her. It was something else. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. His body refused to move, trapped under the weight of her gaze. Then, the shadows shifted. Something crawled out from beneath the chair. Daniel's stomach dropped. A hand, thin, stretched, wrong. It gripped the floor, pulling something else up with it, something hidden beneath her chair. A second figure, faceless, twisted, mimicking. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. His legs finally obeyed, and he bolted. The wolves warned. He didn't stop running until he was outside again, the freezing wind hitting him like a wall. The silver wolf stood directly in front of him, its breath curling in the cold. Daniel collapsed onto his knees, gasping. His entire body was trembling. The door behind him let out a low groan. And then, it moved. The entire house shifted. The wood creaked as if something massive was shifting inside its walls, as if it had woken up. Daniel lifted his head, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His mother's voice, or whatever had worn her face, was still calling softly from inside. But the wolves weren't looking at the house anymore. They were looking at him. And in their glowing eyes, Daniel finally saw the truth. He had been here before, and he had never been meant to leave. The house remembers. Daniel sat in the snow, his chest rising and falling in short, panicked gasps. His fingers dug into the frozen ground, as if trying to anchor himself to something real, something solid. But nothing felt real anymore. Not the house behind him, shifting like a living thing. Not the voice calling his name from within, wearing his mother's face. Not even the wolves, their glowing eyes filled with something that looked too much like recognition. The silver wolf stepped forward, its breath curling in the cold night air. And then, once more, it spoke. "You are not supposed to be here." The voice wasn't like before. It didn't come as a whisper in his ear. It rang inside his skull, clear and heavy, like the weight of something ancient pressing against his mind. Daniel swallowed hard. "Why?" His own voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "What the hell is this place? Who are you?" The wolf stared at him for a long, unbearable moment. Then, slowly, it lowered its head. Not in submission, but in something almost like mourning. "You don't remember." Daniel's blood turned to ice, the way the wolf said it. Not as a question, not as a guess, a statement. Daniel opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the front door of the house swung open, not creaking, not groaning, just opening. Silently, welcoming him. And inside, a warm golden light flickered in the hallway, casting long, reaching shadows onto the porch. Then, the voice came again. Software sweet. "Danny, please come home." Daniel flinched. His whole body went rigid, because it wasn't just his mother's voice anymore. It was his own. The vision in the snow. A rush of nausea twisted in his stomach. His head pounded, memories clawed at the edges of his mind, blurred and fragmented. The wolves didn't move. They just watched. And somehow, Daniel knew. They were waiting for him to make a choice. He turned away from the house, away from the thing inside. His gaze swept across the frozen landscape, over the stretch of woods beyond the clearing. And for the first time, he noticed something strange. Footprints, his own, leading from the forest. But the snow around them was untouched. No car tracks, no signs of travel, only his footprint appearing out of nowhere, as if he had simply begun here. A sharp, icy pain stabbed through his skull. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his hands against his temples. His mind was fighting against something, a fog he couldn't push through. But then, the silver wolf took another step forward, and suddenly a memory hit him. The woods, a dark road, a car skidding on ice, the flash of headlights, the violent crash of metal against a tree, and then, the house. Daniel gasped, his eyes snapping open. His breath came in quick, uneven bursts. He had been here before, not just years ago. Tonight, he had crashed his car, and then somehow, he had ended up at this house. But he still didn't remember. The silver wolf's voice pressed into his skull again. It will try to make you remember the wrong way. Daniel's stomach twisted. And then, from inside the house, a floorboard creaked. The thing that wore his face. The wolves bristled, their hackles rising. Daniel's breath hitched. He turned his head just enough to see a figure in the doorway. Tall, familiar. Him. Daniel's own reflection stood just inside the house, bathed in golden candlelight. It was him, down to the last detail. Same face, same clothes, same haunted look in his eyes, except its lips were smiling. Daniel stumbled back, his heartbeat slamming against his ribs. His other self took a step forward. The wooden floor groaned beneath its weight, the sound sending a shiver up Daniel's spine. Then it spoke, and when it did, its voice came from inside his own head. Come back inside. Daniel's vision blurred. His knees buckled, his body suddenly weak, lightheaded. It felt like something was pulling him forward, drawing him back into the house. No, this was wrong. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently, his hands clenched into fists. And just when he thought he would collapse, a snarl shattered the air. Daniel's eyes flew open. The silver wolf had stepped between him and the house, teeth bared, its fur bristling with raw energy. And behind it, the other wolves had done the same, forming a protective barrier between him and the thing that wore his face. The air crackled, and for the first time, the house growled back. The wolves' truth. The wind howled. The shadows inside the house shifted, and Daniel knew. He was running out of time. The silver wolf turned its head slightly, locking eyes with him. We cannot save you, unless you choose. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry as bone. He turned to look at the house. It was waiting. Warm, inviting, whispering in a voice that sounded like his mother, like him. But Daniel knew now. The house wasn't a home. It was a trap, and whatever lived inside it, it wanted him back. His body trembled, his mind screamed, and then Daniel made his choice, the choice that couldn't be undone. The house was waiting. Warmth spilled from its open door, golden light flickering against the frozen ground. The voice, the one that sounded like his mother, like him, was still calling. Softly, gentle, welcoming. And just beyond the threshold, Daniel's other self stood motionless. Same face, same body, but not him. The wolves stood between him and the house, their fur bristling, their breath curling in the icy air. Their eyes glowed like embers in the dark, and the silver one, the one that spoke, was watching him closely, waiting. Daniel's body ached from indecision. His mind felt split in two, like something inside was trying to pull him apart. If he stepped forward, the house would take him back. If he stepped away, would it let him go? His hands clenched into fists. His breath came in ragged gasps. The wind howled through the clearing, biting against his skin. And then, the thing in the doorway moved. Daniel's other self lifted a hand, palm outstretched, like a mirror reflection, a perfect invitation. "Come back inside." The voice rang in Daniel's mind, his own voice, but empty, hollow. And in that moment, a sharp, searing pain split through his skull. Memories that weren't his flashes of something, memories that didn't belong to him, flooded his mind. A little boy, standing in this very clearing, a woman, his mother, laughing softly as she reached for him. A house, standing tall and wrong, its walls pulsing as if alive, and then screaming. Daniel staggered backward. The ground felt unsteady beneath him, like the earth itself had become uncertain. The silver wolf stepped forward. "Do you see now?" Daniel gasped, blinking hard. The memories were slipping away, retreating like shadows at dawn. But one thing was clear now. This wasn't the first time he had been here. It wasn't even the second. Somewhere, deep inside, he already knew what this house was, and he knew what it wanted. The house hungered. The thing in the doorway stepped forward just slightly, just enough for the golden light behind it to cast a shadow that did not match its shape. Daniel's pulse spiked. The shadow was wrong. Too tall, too many limbs. Its head split open into something gaping and jagged. Daniel stumbled away. The wolves snarled, and for the first time, the house reacted. The golden glow inside flickered. The warm air turned cold. The house knew it was losing him. The wolves' warning. The silver wolf's voice came again, sharper now, urgent. "Choose, Daniel, now." His breath came fast and ragged. His skin was cold, but sweat prickled at his forehead, and behind him, the house creaked. No, not creaked, breathed. The floorboards stretched, groaned, shifted. The walls bulged, as if something huge inside was pressing against them, waiting to be let out. And the voice inside, his mother's, his own, began to change. It twisted, distorted, until it was nothing but a low, wet gurgling. Daniel's body reacted before his mind. He turned and ran. The house does not forgive. The wolves moved with him, fast, fluid, silent. Their paws made no sound against the frozen ground. Behind them, the house screamed. Not a human scream, not even an animal scream. Something deeper, older. The door slammed shut, rattling the windows. The golden light inside went dark, and the air turned still. For a long moment, Daniel kept running. He didn't look back. He didn't stop. But then, the silver wolf slowed, and Daniel felt it too. A shift in the air. Something had changed. A horrible truth. He turned. The house was still there, dark, silent, watching. But now, there were footprints in the snow, leading away from the house, not his, not the wolves', someone else's, and they were fresh. Daniel's stomach dropped. Slowly, his eyes followed the trail. The footprints wound away from the house, vanishing into the woods. They were small, light, like a child's, and then, at the very edge of the clearing, a figure stood, just barely visible between the trees, small, still. Daniel's breath hitched. It was a boy, no older than 7 or 8, dark hair, familiar features, and the moment Daniel saw him, the boy turned and ran. Daniel's heart stopped because he knew that face. It was his own, and Daniel knew. He was running out of time. The silver wolf turned its head slightly, locking eyes with him. "We cannot save you unless you choose." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry as bone. He turned to look at the house. It was waiting, warm, inviting, whispering in a voice that sounded like his mother, like him. But Daniel knew now. The house wasn't a home. It was a trap, and whatever lived inside it, it wanted him back. His body trembled, his mind screamed, and then Daniel made his choice, a choice that couldn't be undone. The house was waiting, warmth spilled from its open door, golden light flickering against the frozen ground. The voice, the one that sounded like his mother, like him, was still calling. Software, gentle, welcoming. And just beyond the threshold, Daniel's other self stood motionless. Same face, same body, but not him. The wolves stood between him and the house, their fur bristling, their breath curling in the icy air. Their eyes glowed like embers in the dark. And the silver one, the one that spoke, was watching him closely, waiting. Daniel's body ached from indecision. His mind felt split in two, like something inside was trying to pull him apart. If he stepped forward, the house would take him back. If he stepped away, would it let him go? His hands clenched into fists. His breath came in ragged gasps. The wind howled through the clearing, biting against his skin. And then, the thing in the doorway moved. Daniel's other self lifted a hand, palm outstretched, like a mirror reflection, a perfect invitation. Come back inside. The voice rang in Daniel's mind, his own voice, but empty, hollow. And in that moment, a sharp, searing pain split through his skull. Memories that weren't his flashes of something, memories that didn't belong to him, flooded his mind. A little boy, standing in this very clearing, a woman, his mother, laughing softly as she reached for him. A house, standing tall and wrong, its walls pulsing as if alive, and then screaming. Daniel staggered backward. The ground felt unsteady beneath him, like the earth itself had become uncertain. The silver wolf stepped forward. Do you see now? Daniel gasped, blinking hard. The memories were slipping away, retreating like shadows at dawn. But one thing was clear now. This wasn't the first time he had been here. It wasn't even the second. Somewhere, deep inside, he already knew what this house was, and he knew what it wanted. The house hungered. The thing in the doorway stepped forward just slightly, just enough for the golden light behind it to cast a shadow that did not match its shape. Daniel's pulse spiked. The shadow was wrong. Too tall, too many limbs. Its head split open into something gaping and jagged. Daniel stumbled away. The wolves snarled, and for the first time, the house reacted. The golden glow inside flickered. The warm air turned cold. The house knew it was losing him. The wolves' warning. The silver wolf's voice came again, sharper now, urgent. Choose, Daniel. Now. His breath came fast and ragged. His skin was cold, but sweat prickled at his forehead. And behind him, the house creaked. No, not creaked. Breathed. The floorboards stretched, groaned, shifted. The walls bulged, as if something huge inside was pressing against them, waiting to be let out. And the voice inside, his mother's, his own, began to change. It twisted, distorted, until it was nothing but a low, wet gurgling. Daniel's body reacted before his mind. He turned and ran. The house does not forgive. The wolves moved with him, fast, fluid, silent. Their paws made no sound against the frozen ground. Behind them, the house screamed. Not a human scream, not even an animal scream. Something deeper, older. The door slammed shut, rattling the windows. The golden light inside went dark, and the air turned still. For a long moment, Daniel kept running. He didn't look back. He didn't stop. But then, the silver wolf slowed, and Daniel felt it too. A shift in the air. Something had changed. A horrible truth. He turned. The house was still there, dark, silent, watching. But now, there were footprints in the snow, leading away from the house, not his, not the wolves', someone else's, and they were fresh. Daniel's stomach dropped. Slowly, his eyes followed the trail. The footprints wound away from the house, vanishing into the woods. They were small, light, like a child's, and then, at the very edge of the clearing, a figure stood, just barely visible between the trees, small, still. Daniel's breath hitched. It was a boy, no older than 7 or 8, dark hair, familiar features, and the moment Daniel saw him, the boy turned and ran. Daniel's heart stopped because he knew that face. It was his own. The boy who shouldn't exist. Daniel stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. The child, his younger self, had already disappeared into the woods. For a long, stretched-out moment, Daniel couldn't move, couldn't think. His brain fought against the impossibility of what he had just seen. That wasn't just some kid. That was him. The silver wolf stood at his side, its gaze locked onto the trees where the boy had vanished. The other wolves bristled, their hackles raised, ears pinned back in warning. They had seen him too. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't some twisted trick of the house. The boy had been real, and now he was running. Daniel didn't stop to question his instincts. His body moved on its own. He ran after him, chasing shadows. The wolves followed, silent, fast. Their presence felt both protective and urgent, as if they knew something Daniel didn't. The air in the woods was thick and heavy, despite the freezing cold. The moment Daniel passed between the trees, a strange pressure settled around him, like stepping into deep water. The footprints in the snow were clear, leading through the dark forest. The boy was just ahead. Daniel could hear him, the soft crunch of footsteps, the rapid, frantic breaths of a child running for his life. Daniel pushed forward, his pulse pounding. "Wait!" he called, his voice hoarse. "Stop, please, who are you?" The boy didn't answer, didn't even look back. He just kept running. The clearing that shouldn't exist, and then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, the boy was gone. Daniel skidded to a stop, gasping for air. The footprints in the snow ended abruptly, as if the boy had simply vanished. Ahead of him, the trees thinned, revealing a small clearing, and in the center of it, Daniel's stomach lurched. A car, his car, crashed against a massive tree, its front end crumpled like an accordion. The windshield was shattered, the hood slick with ice. The driver's side door hung open, and on the ground beneath it, fresh blood stained the snow. A sharp, crushing weight slammed into Daniel's chest. His mind reeled, memories crashing into him all at once. The road, the ice, the sudden skid, the impact. He stumbled forward, his legs numb. This wasn't right. This wasn't possible. He had woken up in the clearing by the house. He had walked here, hadn't he? His breath hitched. He reached out with a shaking hand, gripping the edge of the driver's door. The metal was ice cold under his fingertips. Slowly, hesitantly, he leaned forward and looked inside. What he saw. The driver's seat was empty. No body, no sign of anyone inside. But the air was thick with the scent of blood. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He turned his gaze downward, toward the dark stain in the snow. It trailed away from the car, small drops leading toward the base of a nearby tree. His heartbeat hammered. There was something lying there. A body. Daniel felt his knees almost buckle. He moved forward in a daze, his vision blurring at the edges. The wolves didn't stop him, didn't make a sound. And then he saw it. His breath caught, his world split open, because the body lying in the snow was him. The horrible realization. Daniel staggered backward, his stomach twisting violently. The body was face down, half buried in the snow, dressed in his clothes, motionless and still. His mind screamed at him to deny it, to reject the impossible sight in front of him. But his eyes couldn't look away, because now he saw the truth. The way the blood had seeped into the snow, the way the body lay unnaturally still. Daniel wasn't just injured, he was dead. The wolves shrieked. A deep, guttural snarl shattered the silence. Daniel turned sharply. The silver wolf stood just behind him, its glowing eyes locked onto his. And then, for the first time, Daniel understood. The house had never been trying to lure him back, because there had never been a way back. He had already died. His body had never walked to the house. He had never left it at all. He had been trapped there from the moment his life had ended. And the wolves, they hadn't been trying to trick him. They had been trying to save him. Daniel's breath came in short, shallow bursts. His hands trembled. His younger self had led him here, to see the truth. But why? Why now? And if he was already dead? What was still inside the house? The wrong reflection. Daniel couldn't breathe. His body, his dead body, lay motionless in the snow, half buried by the cold. His clothes were the same. His face, though pale and lifeless, was unmistakably his. And yet, he was standing here, breathing. Was he a ghost? Was he something else? His thoughts were spiraling, the weight of it all pressing down on his chest when the silver wolf growled, not at him, at something behind him. Daniel's pulse spiked. Slowly, his body moving with an eerie, unnatural stillness, he turned his head and saw the house. It had followed him. It shouldn't have been there. Daniel had run. He had left it behind. The moment the door slammed shut, he should have been free. But there it was, standing exactly where it had been before. Dark, silent, waiting. The air around it shimmered, as if the house had been ripped from one place and dropped into another. The trees surrounding it bent away, as if they too wanted nothing to do with it. A deep, heavy wrongness radiated from it. Daniel's stomach turned. "No," he whispered. "You shouldn't be here." The house did not care, and then the door creaked open. Something else was wearing his skin. Daniel couldn't move. A golden light flickered inside the doorway, stretching across the frozen ground. And then, someone stepped out. Daniel's breath caught. It was him. Not the younger version. Not the lifeless body in the snow. Him. Except not. This thing looked exactly like him. The same clothes, the same hair, the same eyes. But when it stepped into the cold, its breath didn't fog in the air. When it moved, the snow beneath its boots didn't crunch. And when it smiled, Daniel felt his insides turn to ice, because the smile was all wrong. Too wide, too sharp, too hungry. The wolves react. The silver wolf snapped its jaws, stepping between Daniel and the thing that wore his face. The others followed, their low growls rumbling through the frozen clearing. But the thing only smiled wider. It tilted its head, studying Daniel with a quiet, eerie curiosity. "You're not supposed to be out here." Daniel flinched. It was his own voice, but hollow, empty, like a recording played back just slightly out of sync. The silver wolf's voice came, sharp and urgent. "Do not answer it!" Daniel's lips parted, heart hammering. His mind screamed at him to say something, to demand answers, to shout, to deny this was happening. But he saw the warning in the wolf's eyes, and he obeyed. He stayed silent. It wants to take him back. The thing that wore his face took another step forward. Its movements were strange, not unnatural, too fluid, too perfect, like someone had learned how a human should walk, should breathe, should blink, and was imitating it exactly. "You wandered too far." Its voice was light, casual, like a friend making a simple observation. It lifted a hand, stretching its fingers as if testing them. "Come back inside." Daniel's blood ran cold. The wolves snarled, but the thing didn't react. It only had eyes for Daniel, waiting, watching. And then it said something that made Daniel's skin crawl, something that sent a sharp electric terror through every nerve in his body. "You don't belong out here. Something is wrong with the world." The words hit him like a physical force. The air around him shifted. Daniel blinked. For half a second, less than that, he saw something beneath the world. The trees, the snow, the sky, all of it. Thin, like a layer of paint over something else. Something deep and dark and endless. Something watching. And in that fraction of a second, Daniel felt something move beneath the surface of reality. Like a giant hand pressing against the back of a curtain. Then, it was gone. The world snapped back into place. But Daniel could still feel it, the weight of it, the knowledge that he had seen something he was never meant to see, and the thing that wore his face was still smiling. A choice he can't take back. Daniel's body felt like it didn't belong to him. His heartbeat was too loud. His breath was too sharp. The wolves were waiting. The silver one spoke again, low and steady. "You must choose, Daniel. Now." The house sighed, a deep exhaling breath. Daniel's lungs seized, and the thing that wore his face reached out its hand, waiting, expecting. Daniel's chest tightened. He could feel it, the pull, the whisper at the edge of his mind, telling him that going back inside would be easier, that he wouldn't have to fight anymore, that he wouldn't have to be afraid. All he had to do was take its hand. But Daniel wasn't ready to die again. He ran. The wolves moved with him, a blur of fur and motion. Behind them, the thing that wore his face let out a long, disappointed sigh. But it didn't chase him. It didn't need to. Because as Daniel fled into the frozen woods, one final, horrible thought settled into his mind. He had seen the truth. He had seen beneath the world. And now, it had seen him. The cracks in the world Daniel ran. The cold air burned his lungs. His legs ached with every step. But he didn't stop. The wolves flanked him, their movements swift and silent. The silver one led the way, cutting through the trees like a streak of moonlight. Behind him, the house loomed, unnaturally still, its doors still open, waiting. And inside, the thing that wore his face watched. Daniel didn't dare look back. He just ran. And yet, the forest around him felt wrong. Running in circles. No matter how far he went, the trees never changed. The same twisted branches, the same endless snow, and, most unsettling of all, his own footprints. They weren't disappearing. They weren't behind him. They were ahead. As if he had already been here before. As if he had already run this path 100 times. His stomach twisted. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, no, no." He pushed forward, faster. His own footprints pushed forward, too. The wolves know the truth. The silver wolf suddenly skidded to a stop. Daniel nearly crashed into it. The other wolves halted, their ears pinned back, their tails stiff. Something was ahead. Daniel's breath came fast and shallow. His body shook with adrenaline, with exhaustion. And then, a whisper, a voice barely audible over the wind. "You can't run, Daniel." His heart stopped. Slowly he turned his head and saw himself. The thing that wore his face. It stood in the path ahead, blocking his way. The thing that had stepped out of the house. The thing that had watched him run. It hadn't chased him. It had simply waited here, because it knew he would come back, because there was nowhere else to go. Daniel's throat tightened. His own face stared back at him, expression eerily calm. And then, it smiled. The world isn't real. The wolves bristled. The silver one stepped forward, its growl low and warning. But the thing wearing Daniel's face didn't react. It just looked at him, studying, waiting. Then, it spoke. "You've already made this choice before." Daniel's blood ran cold. The thing tilted its head. "You always try to run." A sharp pressure stabbed through Daniel's skull. A memory, something deep, buried, locked away. A flash of white. A voice, his voice, whispering in the dark. "I don't want to die again." Daniel staggered. His breath hitched. He had said that before. But when? The loop he can't escape. A heavy silence settled over the clearing. The thing that wore his face didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stared, its unblinking eyes holding something horrible. Knowledge. And then, softly, almost kindly, it spoke again. You don't remember, do you? Daniel's chest ached. Something was pressing against his mind, pushing. Something he didn't want to see. The silver wolf's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and desperate. Daniel, do not listen. But it was too late, because in that moment, the world split open. The fractured truth. A flood of memories hit him all at once. Not new memories, old ones. Ones he had lived before. Daniel standing in this same spot. Daniel running from the house. Daniel realizing the world was wrong. And always coming back. This moment had happened before. He had run before. He had stood here in this frozen nightmare and looked into his own stolen face again and again and again. His stomach turned. This wasn't just one night. This wasn't just one story. He was stuck. A game. He never agreed to play. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps. His body shook. The wolves had known. That's why they had tried to stop him from running. Because there was nowhere to run. Because this wasn't the first time. And if he made the wrong choice, it wouldn't be the last. Daniel's voice trembled. What are you? The thing smiled. You already know. A deep, horrible certainty settled in Daniel's bones, and suddenly, he didn't feel cold anymore. The house always wins. Daniel felt like he was falling. The weight of the truth pressed down on him like an avalanche, crushing the air from his lungs. This moment, this exact moment, had happened before. Not once, not twice, countless times. He had run. He had found himself back here. He had faced the thing that wore his face, and then he had forgotten. The memory of all his past attempts vanished, and the cycle had started over. He wasn't just trapped, he was being reset. The wolves never left him. A low growl snapped Daniel out of his spiraling thoughts. The silver wolf was still by his side. The others surrounded him, their eyes locked on the imposter. They had always been here, guiding him, protecting him, even when he didn't remember. But why? The silver wolf spoke, voice tight. You must choose, Daniel. Daniel's breath hitched. That's what the wolf had said before, every time. And every time Daniel had made a choice. But had it ever been the right one? The copy speaks. The thing that wore his face took a step forward, slow, measured. Its smile didn't falter. You understand now. Daniel's throat tightened. It didn't sound disappointed. It sounded pleased, like it had been waiting for him to figure it out. Daniel swallowed hard. His fingers curled into fists. What do you want from me? The copy tilted its head. What do you mean? Daniel's pulse pounded. Why am I here? Why does this keep happening? The copy blinked. Then, calmly, almost amused, it said, because you never make it out. There is no escape. The words sent a violent chill through Daniel's veins. He never makes it out, because he always fails, because he always chooses wrong. A sickening dread settled in his stomach. Was there even a way out? Or was he doomed to repeat this forever? The silver wolf stepped closer, pressing against Daniel's leg. Its fur was warm, grounding, real. Not this time, it said. We will break it. The wrong move. Daniel wanted to believe that. But the copy wasn't worried. It simply watched. And then it raised a hand. Daniel's breath stopped. The copy's fingers curled, not at him, but at the world around them. And suddenly, everything shifted. The trees melted. The ground beneath his feet cracked. The sky ripped apart. And behind it, darkness, deep, endless, alive. Daniel's mind screamed, the world is fake. The wolves snarled. The silver one barked, Daniel, close your eyes. He couldn't. He was too afraid. Because for the first time, he saw what was truly beneath this world. Not snow, not trees. Something vast, something waiting. And the house. The house wasn't a house at all. It was a door to something that wanted him. had always wanted him, and he had been stepping through it over and over again. The wolf's final warning. A sharp pain lanced through his skull. His knees buckled. The silver wolf shoved against him, forcing him back to his feet. "Choose, Daniel!" Daniel gasped. The world was unraveling. The copy was still smiling, waiting. The house stood open, waiting. The darkness beneath the world shifted, waiting. And Daniel realized something horrible. He wasn't just being given a choice, he was being given a test, one he had already failed before. A different path. His hands shook, his chest burned. But this time, he wasn't alone. The wolves were here. And for the first time, he wondered, had they always been? Had they always been trying to save him? He turned to the silver wolf, eyes desperate. "What do I do?" The wolf stared at him, unblinking. "Don't go back inside." Daniel froze. It seemed so simple, but that's exactly what made it so terrifying. Because if the house had always been the trap, then maybe, just maybe, the only way to win was to refuse to play. The path unseen. Daniel's breath came in short, sharp bursts. His fingers were numb, his mind a storm of fractured memories. He stood on the edge of something terrible. Behind him, the house loomed, a dark mouth waiting to swallow him whole. Before him, the copy stood watching, its expression calm, and the wolves surrounded him, their silver eyes gleaming in the unraveling world. The silver wolf's words echoed in his mind. "Don't go back inside." Was it really that simple? Had the answer always been there? Daniel's jaw clenched. He looked at the house, his supposed way out, and he turned away. The copy reacts. A flicker of something passed through the copy's face, the first hint of true emotion. Not fear, not anger, but curiosity. Interesting. The ground beneath Daniel shuddered. A deep, resonant groan filled the air, like the forest itself was in pain. The trees warped, their branches stretching like grasping fingers. The sky darkened, swirling like ink dissolving in water. Something was changing. Something was watching. The copy tilted its head. "You think that will work?" Daniel didn't answer. He took a step back, then another, and then he ran. The wolves lead the way. The silver wolf barked. The pack moved in sync, forming a shield around Daniel as they sprinted deeper into the woods. But the trees were closing in. The world around them twisted, bent, folded in on itself. Snow froze in midair, shadows stretched in impossible directions. The very fabric of reality was coming apart. A voice, not the copy's, but something older, whispered through the air. "You cannot leave." Daniel clenched his teeth and pushed forward. Number not this time. The house had always been the lure, the false salvation. If he had any chance of breaking free, he had to do the opposite of what he had always been. He had to reject the rules. The copy pursues. A sound like cracking ice split the air. Daniel risked a glance over his shoulder, and his blood ran cold. The copy was no longer standing. It was crawling, its limbs stretched, bending unnaturally as it moved with inhuman speed. Its face was frozen in an unmoving grin, as if its features had been carved from glass. It was catching up. Daniel ran faster. The edge of the world. The trees thinned. Something glowed ahead, a faint, flickering light. Daniel's pulse spiked. Had he ever seen this before, or had he never made it this far? The silver wolf barked, "Do not stop!" The wind howled, carrying voices, his own voice, whispering warnings from past failures. "Turn back. The house is the only way. You can't escape. Lies. Lies." Daniel grit his teeth and charged forward, and then he crossed the threshold, breaking the cycle. The world lurched. The cold vanished. The ground beneath his feet was no longer snow. It was stone. Daniel gasped, his body jerking like he had been thrown from a great height. Everything was silent. The howling wind, gone. The pursuit, stopped. He turned. The forest was gone. The house was gone. The copy was gone. In their place was nothing. Just a vast, endless black void. The world he had been trapped in was gone. Where is he now? Daniel's breath shook. The wolves were still with him, standing at his side. They had made it too. The silver wolf looked up at him, its silver eyes calm. "You broke it." Daniel swallowed. I did?" The wolf nodded, and then softly, "But we are not safe yet." Daniel stiffened. His heart pounded as he turned his gaze forward, and that's when he saw it. A door. Not the same one from before. This one was ancient, massive, carved from something unnatural. And worse, it was already open. Something waited beyond it. Something that had been watching all along. The door that should not exist. Daniel's breath was ragged as he stared at the massive door before him. It was wrong, not in the way something old and decayed might be, but in a way that made his mind reject it entirely. It was impossible. It was ancient, towering above him, carved from a material that shifted between black stone, rotting wood, and pulsing flesh. Symbols he couldn't recognize but somehow understood slithered across its surface, disappearing and reappearing like whispers in the dark. The wolves stood by his side, their silver eyes reflecting the light of the strange place he had entered. The silver wolf, always the leader, did not look relieved. "You have come too far." The words were not a warning. They were an undeniable truth. Daniel swallowed hard. He turned back, but there was nothing. The frozen woods, the twisted house, the crawling doppelganger, gone. The world behind him was now an endless black void. His chest tightened. "Where are we?" The silver wolf exhaled slowly. "At the threshold." Daniel glanced at the door. The threshold to what? Then he saw it. The door was open, not fully, just a crack. But something waited beyond it, and it was watching him. The whispers beyond. A sound oozed from the crack in the door, something between a whisper and a slithering mass shifting through the dark. It was speaking. It was calling his name. Daniel. His knees nearly buckled. He had heard that voice before, not in a dream, not in a nightmare, but in his own memories. It was the voice of someone he had forgotten, and suddenly the room wasn't silent anymore. It was screaming. The wolves react. The silver wolf stepped forward, placing itself between Daniel and the door. The other wolves lowered their heads, growling, their fur bristling with silent fury. Daniel had never seen them act this way. Not against the house, not against the copy, only against this. The silver wolf's voice was calm but final. "You must not go inside." Daniel's fingers trembled. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest. I know that voice," he whispered. He felt it pulling at him, not just his mind, his soul, and that was the moment Daniel realized. The house had never been the prison. This was. What lies beyond? The crack in the door widened just slightly, not by force, not by will, but by invitation. It wanted him to see. And so, against his better judgment, Daniel looked. And he saw a place that should not exist. A world where the sky was flesh and the ground pulsed like a heartbeat. A place where shadows did not move with the light, they moved on their own. And in the distance, something immense and unseen shifted, something that had been waiting for him. And then he saw her, a figure standing in the center of the impossible landscape, bathed in shifting darkness. Her back was to him. But he knew who she was, even if he had forgotten her face. The whisper slithered into his mind again, gentle and wrong. "Come home, Daniel." His breath caught in his throat. Memories that didn't belong to him clawed at his mind. Flashes of something before the house, before the wolves, before the lie he had called his life. Daniel took a step forward. The silver wolf snapped its jaws, a sharp, immediate warning. "If you enter, You will not return." Daniel hesitated. His mind was screaming at him to stop, but his soul was telling him something else, something worse. What if the wolves weren't saving him? What if they were keeping him from something he was supposed to remember? The door creaked, opening just a little wider. And then, the thing in the distance began to move. The truth that should never be known. Daniel's breath hitched. The thing beyond the door stirred, a shifting mass of something so enormous, so utterly alien, that his mind recoiled in terror. It didn't move like a creature. It moved like the world itself was breathing, and standing before it, wrapped in shadows, was the woman. She hadn't turned yet, but he knew. Knew her the way one knows an old scar, forgotten, yet forever etched into flesh. "Come home, Daniel." The words slithered through his mind, unraveling him like frayed string. The wolves tensed, their fur bristling, growls rolling low in their throats. The silver wolf stood firm, blocking Daniel's path to the door. "Close your mind to it," the wolf commanded. "It is not yours to remember." Daniel's hands trembled. I know her," he whispered. The silver wolf's ears flattened. That is not a blessing. A deep, suffocating dread pressed against Daniel's chest, because the wolf wasn't telling him he was wrong. It was telling him he was right. Memories that don't belong. The world beyond the door twisted and pulsed like something half alive. Daniel could feel it inside his head now, whispers crawling through his skull, unspooling memories that didn't fit. Not childhood, not dreams, something before, a place not meant for humans, and he had been there. He staggered back, gripping his head as flashes of impossible things flooded his mind. A city that wasn't made of stone, but of flesh and bone, shifting and pulsing in eternal hunger. Skies that bled, oceans that whispered, a throne and something sitting upon it, watching, waiting, and a promise, a vow sealed not in blood, but in something older. Older than the house, older than the wolves, older than time itself. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. What did I do?" The silver wolf bared its teeth. "You forgot." The thing beyond the door shifted closer. The woman turned, and Daniel saw her face. The woman beyond the door. She was not human. Not anymore. Her skin was cracked like ancient porcelain, black veins crawling beneath the surface. Her eyes, oh God, her eyes, were holes in reality, bottomless voids that drank the light. And yet, she was familiar. A name sat on his tongue, rusted and decayed, yet still his. Eleanor. She smiled, and in that moment, Daniel felt something snap. The world twisted, and suddenly he remembered. Not the house, not the wolves, not even the life he thought was his, but the truth, the thing he had been running from all along. The wolves' final warning. The silver wolf lunged, snapping at Daniel's wrist. Pain shot through him, sharp, electric, and just like that, the memory shattered. Daniel gasped, stumbling backward. His vision blurred. The door, the woman, the shifting horror beyond. They flickered like a dying dream. The silver wolf pressed its forehead against his. Its voice was gentle, firm, final. "She is not yours anymore." Daniel's heart pounded. His skin felt cold. His mind fogged, slipping between what was real and what had been stolen from him. He tried to speak, tried to ask who she was, tried to ask who he had been. But before he could, the silver wolf growled deep in its throat, and the door slammed shut. The door is shut, but the horror remains. The silence after the door slammed shut was deafening. Daniel collapsed onto his knees, his body trembling from the shock of what he had seen, what he had remembered. His mind still pulsed with fragments of impossible memories, but they were fading, unraveling like threads burning away in unseen fire. The wolves circled him, their silver eyes filled with something strange. Not relief, regret. The silver wolf let out a deep breath, its voice measured but firm. "It is done." Daniel's breath was shallow. His head felt wrong, empty, yet heavy, like something vital had been scooped out of him. He could still feel her. Not in the way one remembers a lost loved one. It was deeper, like a wound barely scabbed over, aching beneath the surface. He lifted his eyes to the silver wolf. Who was she? The wolf did not answer. Instead, it turned away, facing the endless black void where the door had once stood. And then Daniel realized the door was gone. The house still calls. For a moment, hope flickered inside him. Had he escaped? Was it over? Then he turned, and his heart plummeted. The house was still there, not the door, not the void. The house. It loomed in the distance, standing impossibly tall against the frozen trees. Closer than before, as if it had been waiting for him to turn around, as if it had been watching. Daniel's stomach churned with a deep, crawling unease. I thought... He swallowed hard. I thought the house was the prison. But it wasn't. Was it? The silver wolf lowered its head. No. Daniel clenched his fists. Then what is it? The wolf's silver eyes locked onto him. The house is what remains. Daniel shivered. Not from the cold, from the understanding. Whatever had been waiting behind the door was something far worse than the house. But the house was still here, and it still had a purpose. The wolves' final decision. The wind howled through the frozen trees, cutting through Daniel's thin clothes. The other wolves shifted uneasily, glancing toward the silver wolf. Waiting. Daniel could feel it. Something had changed. The wolves had brought him here for a reason. They had protected him, guided him, stopped him from opening that door. But now they were hesitating. Tell me the truth, Daniel whispered. Am I supposed to go back inside? The wolves did not move, but they did not deny it. Daniel's breath shook. Why? The silver wolf exhaled, and in that moment, Daniel swore he saw something like sorrow pass through its glowing eyes. Because you are the only one who can end it. The words rang inside his head like a bell tolling in an empty church. Daniel's pulse pounded against his skull. End it. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a warrior. He was just a man. A broken, terrified man, who had somehow stumbled into something far bigger than himself. But deep down, in the part of him that still ached from what he had seen beyond the door, he knew. The wolf was right. This wasn't over. It had never been over. One final choice. Daniel stood on shaking legs, his body weak, but his resolve slowly solidifying. The house stood ahead, silent, waiting. The wolves watched him with unreadable expressions. They would not force him. This choice, his final choice, was his alone. Daniel closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, he spoke with quiet certainty. Tell me what I need to do. The house will not let him go. The wind howled through the frozen trees as Daniel stood before the house, its towering structure dark and waiting. The wolves remained silent. They had guided him this far. They had stopped him from remembering too soon. But now, this was his choice. Daniel steeled himself and stepped forward. The snow beneath his feet crunched, the air so cold it felt like glass in his lungs. His heart hammered as he neared the front steps, his body screaming at him to run, to turn back. But there was nowhere left to run, not anymore. Crossing the threshold. As Daniel climbed the steps, the door creaked open, slowly, deliberately, as if the house knew he was coming. A breath of cold, stagnant air spilled from within. Daniel hesitated, then stepped inside. Inside the house. The air was thick. Wrong. The walls pulsed, breathing in some unseen rhythm. The wooden floors stretched into unnatural darkness, and the ceiling felt too high, too distant, as if the house was shifting around him. He took a cautious step forward, his breath shallow. The door behind him slammed shut. The wolves were gone. He was alone. The echoes of the past. As he moved deeper, the house whispered. Not in words, in memories. His memories. A voice calling his name in the dark. A promise made beneath a sky that no longer exists. A woman's laughter, distant, fading, then swallowed by something hungry. And then, a whisper not from the house. From her. You left me. Daniel turned sharply. There, at the end of the hall, stood Eleanor, or what was left of her, the woman in the shadows. She was wretchedly thin, her skin cracked and darkened, veins spreading like rot beneath the surface, but her eyes, empty black voids, never left him. She smiled, not with warmth, with something else, something that knew him, something that remembered what he was. You're back. Daniel's hands curled into fists. What am I? He whispered. She took a step closer. The house shuddered. You were mine. The words struck him like a knife. Memories surged, images of a world that should not exist, a place where the sky bled, where things beyond understanding crawled beneath the surface of reality. And Eleanor was there. They had been something else, not human. The truth that cannot be unseen. His body trembled. I don't understand, he breathed. What did I do? Eleanor's smile faltered. You broke the cycle, she whispered. You tried to run, but you can't escape what you are. The walls around them groaned, shadows lengthening, stretching like fingers. You belong here, Daniel. Daniel's breath hitched. The house was not just a house. It was a cage, a prison built for something that should never have existed. And he had been part of it. He had helped build it. The wolves